You're listening to Making Data Simple, where we make the world of data effortless, relevant, and yes, even fun.
Hey folks, welcome back to Making Data Simple. Al here. Today is election day. I don't know when this podcast will ultimately be published, but it's election day. What is it, November, 6th? Is that where we're at? I don't know. So with that, I'll just jump right in. I've got Jean Bozman and Dan Kirsch, and we're going to talk about data optimization today. Jean is the Vice President and Principal Analyst at Hurwitz Associates. She focuses on IT markets for databases, servers, storage, and software. And Dan, who's a returning guest, is the Managing Director at Hurwitz and Associates, and he focuses on data compliance, governance, security, privacy. I know he also focuses on machine learning. So, as I said, Dan, you've been here before, right? I think you were with Judy Hurwitz, right, who is the CEO of Hurwitz and Associates.
Yeah, so the last time we were here, we were talking about a new book we had just written for IBM, Machine Learning for Dummies.
Right, Machine Learning for Dummies. A good book, which I would recommend, by the way. So here's my first question to you before I jump into intros. Who does all the work there? Is it Jean, is it Judy, or is it you? Don't worry, no one's listening. You can say what you really mean.
I
don't know.
No, the reality is everything we work on is a real collaboration. We pass things between us. We've got a few other people on the team also, and try and have a few sets of eyes on everything so that everything comes out sort of as a consistent one voice, even though everyone's got their own opinions, and fun to express those in blogs or podcasts.
And speaking of election day, are you running for office? That was a pretty political answer right there. No, it's probably good, though. It's probably the same way I would answer it.
Al, I just want to add that we all write a lot, and I think one of the great things is that people can view the research as it's not gated on the blogs. So that's kind of a nice thing, and they can look in at what we're writing that week, for example.
And while we're on that, where is that posted?
On Hurwitz, www.hurwitz.com.
Very good. I know I'll be there. So I saw you, Jean, last at the Winning for AI event in New York that IBM hosted. I appreciate you attending. Judy was there as well. And, I guess the first thing is as I let you introduce yourself, I do this podcast, of course, and sometimes it just clicks with people, sometimes a little bit more business. It's a little harder. Well, in New York, when I saw you, we sat down and we decided to have a follow-up podcast because we talked, and I think we talked it seemed like 2 minutes in like 30 minutes, and there was just a lot to talk about because you have some of the same passions as I do around data. So anyway, I'm looking forward to today. Let me shut up for a moment if I could. And Jean, I'll let you introduce yourself, and then Dan, you can reintroduce yourself. Jean?
Okay, well, I've been in the industry for a super long time, and the analyst part of it extends back over 20 years. I've been in a number of companies, including IDC and Hurwitz, been at Hurwitz the last 3 years. My interest in data goes back to the early 90s. I started covering the database industry when I landed here on the West Coast, having moved out from New York and then Chicago. So I really came at an interesting time where there were just any number of companies doing relational database, including, of course, IBM with DB2, and then Oracle and lots of competitors. So it was a kind of heady time in the SQL space. Did that, and then I followed it as it moved over time. I've written a lot about clustering, about scale out, and what's so interesting now is to see people examining what they're going to do with their data silos, how they're going to change them, and mostly how they're going to get their arms around what kind of data they have and make it easier to work with, make it more manageable. So I always call it the never-ending story. It just gets better.
Great, fantastic. I already got a couple of questions for you, but I'll let Dan introduce himself again.
So I am a recovering lawyer, so a little bit of a technology background. So I joined Hurwitz about 8 years ago and focused a lot on cloud, data, security, machine learning, and really sort of where all those things intersect, a lot with data quality, DevOps, and then obviously doing that legal side, so I'm always thinking about sort of governance, risk, and what you're doing with this data, how you're protecting it, and then also sort of when you have the machine learning, predictive analytics, AI, what are sort of the ramifications of the predictions? So I don't think that the world is going to be taken over by robots anytime soon, but whether you're making predictions in an ethical way, it's an interesting area.
So just, I got some follow-up questions for you as well, but location, I think, Jean, you're in Palo Alto right now?
Yes, I am.
Where do you call home, though?
That's it.
Oh, I mean, but...
Well, the truth is I'm bi-coastal, though.
Yeah, so you do a lot of traveling then, I presume?
I do a lot of traveling back to New York from whence I come.
That's killer travel. But where is home? I mean, is it Palo Alto, or do you say, look, I got to get back home to my family, and that's it?
It's mostly Palo Alto, but I get to New York quite a bit.
Yeah. How about you, Dan?
So our office is a couple miles outside of Boston in a town called Needham, and cold and rainy today. And then home is in Cambridge.
Very good. All right, I got it. By the way, do you guys vote today? Everybody get their vote done?
Not yet, but in California we have lots of time.
Who are you going to vote for? No, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to ask you that question.
I don't know, but I'm one of those religious voters, meaning I vote religiously.
Yeah, good.
Every single time I have a whole thing, I have coffee, I line up my answers, and I go every single time. Yeah.
Massachusetts has early voting, which is wonderful. No lines. You go at your leisure over a 2-week period, and then if you forget to, you can go on election day.
That's what I do as well.
I think that's for suckers.
I'm in Kansas, as you know, and I can't stand a line, so I voted I think almost 2 weeks ago.
Wow.
But I do have a question as it relates to elections, but how it ties into data. So stay with me here. The first question I have is, it's interesting to me, and I think we talked about this, Jean, when you were in New York. You've done a lot of research. You've been in the industry a lot. Then Dan, I'm listening to you. You're a recovering lawyer. And so I got a lot of questions in there, in that, one thing it seems like you guys do extremely well is continue to reinvent yourself and continue to learn and continue to research and continue to write and post blogs. You already talked about that. I'd like you to say a few words about that in terms of how you maintain that entitlement. And as a part B to that question, I've always, look, I sit in a lot of meetings with advisory firms, like some of the ones you mentioned, like IDC or Gartner. And I've often thought, well, that would be a fun job. I get to learn all day, I get inside information, and I tell others what to do. Is that a good job? Do you guys see it the same way? I mean, I presume you do. You're still in the business, but part A and part B.
Yeah, well, I view it, in fact, as an opportunity to be a perpetual student. I've always enjoyed studying, and this is no exception. You need to be to stay on top of things, and I would say that the opportunity to meet with people, particularly conferences, I use that. I go to a lot of conferences, and I make sure not only to hear the keynotes and the breakouts, but just to sort of do the coffee break stuff with the regular people who are attending, and that's how I really try to get a different angle on where people are in adoption rather than where the vendors say they are. That's a good input to the research.
Just like to add, you got to be a continual learner to be in this business, but also I sort of see ourselves as canaries in the coal mine. We're talking to vendors all the time. We're at vendor events. We're at analyst-only events. And so when there's something that we don't understand or we're confused about, the clients are really going to be confused because they don't have the time. They actually have to do their job, surprisingly, and not sit there and analyze, a dozen options and the companies and the company culture and the new offerings. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of fun to really give some insight.
So Dan, you've not. I don't think you've told me this before, but so how do you go from being lawyer to being data man extraordinaire?
Well, I started doing some consulting with Hurwitz for about a year and a half, really focused on data security and governance. And then they made the offer for me to join full time, and I took the leap and went with it. I mean, partly there's just something different every day. One day we could be talking to IBM. The next day we're talking to a 3-person startup who's got a really cool technology, and absolutely no clue how to sell it, explain it, but it's cool and it potentially could work.
Yeah.
Do you guys both spend most of your time just advising? Companies call you in and say, look, we don't know what the hell we're doing here, whether it's data, security, any of the topics that you guys went through, and then it could be healthcare, media, or otherwise, and you give them guidance, or do you also, pretty much lay out the plan from end to end if they ask you to do so, or is it more, look, we're going to give you the guidance, we're going to let you take the execution steps?
So we don't go all the way typically to execution. I think oftentimes companies we'll help them identify good people to do it, and we'll lead them along. For instance, we have services where we're sort of an on-call service where we can talk. The client can pick up the phone, call us, and say, "Gee, I've got this problem. I need a half hour of your time to talk about it." Or it can even be, can you look at these resumes? And then we also talk to end user companies, advise them on technology choices that they should be making, and we also spend a tremendous amount of time writing thought leadership. We've written dozens of custom dummies books, a bunch of retail books, so that writing takes up an awful lot of time as well.
So if you're a learner, this seems like it'd be a dream job. You got to tell me something that's not so great about it. Keep me balanced here.
Okay, traveling.
All right, that's fair. I know you got to go from West Coast to East Coast, so I know how that is. That's a full day event.
Yeah, like tomorrow I'm flying coast to coast, and then going to a conference there, and actually I'm going to a conference in Europe week after next, the Open Stack conference. So it's a lot of travel, but when you get there, it's well worthwhile.
And the other end, clients, of course. Deadlines that were yesterday.
Yes.
Changing goals. It can be challenging, but keeps it interesting.
Right, and also I think we might have mentioned this, Dan, but I mean, people come to us, being that we have a reputation in the industry. People come to us to ask us some questions, and they initiate. So I think we have to make that clear as well.
Yep.
So back to the election. I got to ask you one question. We'll just keep moving on, but. No, I'm not going to get into political. Don't worry. Relax. But I'm just saying, what role do you guys think the government plays in data today? I got to believe you're also advising maybe, some federal clients, et cetera. The interesting thing for me is when, I don't know, not so long ago, companies would say, hey, we're just making the technology. It's not our job to protect it otherwise. And I think we've completely shifted. Hell, now even on the iPhone, I just got the new iPhone. I'm not giving an advertisement here, but it gives you, it tells me how much I'm using it for productivity use versus entertainment. And so it seems like there is a shift in the environment where companies are taking more responsibility. So the government, I guess my question is do you agree or does it go, do you look at that when you vote, or is it completely unrelated areas?
Well, I just think where we could be helpful here is to say that clearly when the security topics come around, I think that's an area that Dan specializes in, and I do, part-time of what I'm doing. That's where government and security and all that comes together. But, more specifically, we got into a topic recently we were writing about when GDPR was coming out and becoming a requirement for people. Maybe Dan could mention about GDPR. Sure, we're sitting here in the United States, but for companies that have European customers, and many do, that's an example of how where you are and where you're a citizen, impacts the type of security that needs to be provided. Especially with data. You're protecting actually the data of the European citizen. Dan, did you want to add something on that?
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't really come into, when I'm voting, I don't really think about what is this candidate's position on data, because quite frankly, in the U.S., it's still a bit of the Wild West. I don't think politicians necessarily have a handle on it. It might be the same in other countries as well. So, in the U.S., we're still letting the vendors are taking the first step, and then the government seems to be reacting. In Europe, as Jean mentioned, we've done a bunch of work with GDPR, and I won't go into all the fun details of the regulation, but it affects any company that stores European Union citizen data. So if you're a U.S. company and you have customers in Europe, you're impacted by GDPR, and the penalties for violating the regulation can be up to 4% of your organization's annual global revenue, which is potentially massive. And it covers almost all personal data. So maybe that's too far. Maybe the U.S. hasn't done enough. Finding that middle ground is something that I think is going to take some time.
Yeah, but so not to go too far into GDPR, do you think that they get it in the European Union then? Is that what you're trying to suggest? Or they get it more than U.S. in terms of where we are today, the wild, wild west? Or do you think they're both problematic by their own, and it's good job security for you guys?
Well, one thing I'd like to add in that vein is that when the U.S. government experts come here and speak, I'm talking about people from the government, like recent conferences, Robert Mueller spoke, Jay Johnson spoke, those people at that level, right? And they've all advocated for a closer contact between the cybersecurity experts in our industry and government, but it appears to be hard to make that happen. They want to do it, but we have a lot to look forward to in the way of a closer partnership there on cybersecurity. Dan, would you agree with that?
I would. And then also the difficulty is if you have the regulations of GDPR, those have been in the U.S. for the last 25 years. I sort of question whether we would have things like Google would look the way it does or Facebook would look the way it does, because really their entire lifeblood is analyzing their customer data, and would they be able to do it in the same way that they can? I'm sure they would develop ways around it. So whether the Europeans sort of get it and the U.S. doesn't, I would question, because I think you need companies to sort of, the Wild West, to have great innovation quickly. On the other hand, there does need to be some control. So I think the perfect spot is somewhere in the middle, and we haven't found it yet.
All right, a good answer. Hey, look, we'll get off the dicey discussion about government. It's just fitting for election day. And, you know, look, data is everywhere, and it's interesting to me. Companies are taking some action. I mean, it's changing, but we need folks like you guys to help provide guidance and advice in terms of, you know, what we need to do around security, et cetera. And by the way, I do know, Dan, that early 2000s, you were an intern for Senator Chuck Schumer, I believe. So you do have some politics in your bag of tricks, right?
You did your research before he was such a national figure, but I set up a fax machine in his condo.
Wow.
It was an interesting experience.
I'm sure it was. Hey, look, so speaking of doing my research, so Dan, we've talked about you before, so no offense, but I'm going to give this is your life gene, right?
Uh-oh.
So I'm just going to go down some skills, and I think they're great talking points. I'm going to say each one of these. You're skilled in database, schema, you're just data savvy. High availability, disaster recovery, moving data, labeling data, so I'd say metadata as far as I'm concerned, or governance. In terms of different industries, media, oil and gas, healthcare, and I know you've got certainly a point of view on skills and what's out there and what should be out there. I mean, I even heard you, I don't know if Dan, you were talking about looking at resumes. So I'd like to dissect a few of those going right down the list, if you wouldn't mind. Does that make sense?
Oh, that's fine. It does suggest a few things here. Go ahead.
What does it suggest? Wait a second. What does it suggest?
Well, one of my main points in my writing is that we're really talking about data awareness, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think what's been hard for people as we break down data silos and as business is changing around us and all those things, we're trying to go to cloud and everything else, is the skill set for the people who work with the data, both from the system administrator all the way up to the chief digital officer, chief data officer, is awareness of where the data is, what it's doing, is it in the best place that it could be, and that calls for a change in skill set for many people, to focus on a little bit different things, to take a deeper look, an introspective look, better inventory of what kind of data they have and what they plan to do with it, and it has to fit into some kind of overall strategy for the organization. Let me give you some quick examples. When you look at healthcare, or even inside a hospital, those data silos came together, let's say in a hospital, the pathology database, the radiology database, and so on, patient inventory database. Now we're standing back and saying, wait a minute, that wasn't necessarily the best way to do that, right? And now in healthcare, multiple hospitals are being merged, right? So on that level, things have to be reorganized. So basically across the board, whether you're in a small, medium, or large organization, you have to be introspective, you have to see what's there, and there's a big call for a cross skill set. So you can't just stay in your own little area. You have to say what else has to be done in this organization to make this data go into the best place, be as secure as possible, be managed better. What kind of policies do we have in place? Those are all, across the organization or Uber organization concerns. And you hear a lot about that, the need to, we're still figuring it out.
So let me throw some metrics at you, and I want to get your reaction.
Okay.
To see if you're accurate, with your boots on the ground.
Okay.
So 15% of organizations leverage data analytics today. Only 0.5% of the data is actually analyzed. 80% of data we don't even assess. It's like behind firewalls or otherwise. You just can't get to it. To your point, it's in a silo someplace. So we're only looking at 20%. Almost, it depends on the metrics. This is why I want to get your view on the metrics, because sometimes you can get different metrics from different sources.
Right.
I think anywhere between 35 and 50% have hybrid deployments today, and there's about 85% that want to have true hybrid deployments, because there's some that they definitely want to move to the cloud. There's some that they do want to keep in their own private cloud. What do your findings tell you on all that?
Well, I think, a lot of it is about the state of adoption. It's about adoption and comfort levels. So when you talk to people and you say, are you doing hybrid cloud? They may say yes, but they may only be doing it in part, and they may not be entirely comfortable about moving more of applications XYZ outside into a public cloud. So it's really the degree to which they've done it. To say hybrid cloud is widely used, I think that would be a fair statement. To say, well, to what degree are you using hybrid cloud? That's a different concept. And in fact, the recent announcement of IBM and Red Hat proved that. IBM, in its own introspection about what's going on, knows people are onto hybrid cloud. They want to go to multi-cloud, but there are a lot of obstacles in their way. And there's a substantial opportunity in getting them to adopt more widely. And that's where we get to comfort level. Concerns about security, concerns about manageability. These are the things that customers are continually telling us are holding them back from doing more.
So do you find that, you said this earlier, that CDOs spend most of their time finding data? We do have metrics that say like 80% of the time of data scientists is spent like cleansing, refining data. And I think that's absolutely true, meaning they only got 20% to really work on maybe what they were hired for in terms of doing true data science. But my experience, and again, your reaction, is that that's not going to change anytime soon with the disparate data sources and the problems with data today.
Well, all this stuff is in motion. It's not static. And I think the role of the CDO is changing, and we're seeing them think about the analysis, but also their strategy. They're setting the strategy. They're setting the tone for the whole organization. How are we going to break down the data silos? How are we going to do it? How can we cross-train people? What are our policies? How much SQL data do we have? How much non-SQL data do we have? And how long is it going to take to get to point B where, things are, it would be easier to do analytics on the data that we have? Is the data in the right place? Is it easy to get at? What roles can access it? These are the kind of high-level questions that the CDOs are thinking about. And then through their organization, a lot of the execution will take place.
So how do you advise them through this? What is your methodology? By example, when I go into a client, what I found to be the easiest means to really figure out where they are and where they want to go is I throw up like a quadrant chart that on the left it's where your data's at. On the right is the digital transformation, even pushing the boundaries of AI. On the left, it's like spending money to save money. It's cost reduction, modernization. On the right, it's moving from IT to the business, and it's about getting different personas involved, like CDOs engaged, business analysts, et cetera, and then pushing some real-time decisions, multi-cloud AI, and I figure out where they are, where they want to go, and I try to figure out the gaps. How do you do it?
Well, I'd like Dan to talk about, our approach to doing this kind of work.
One thing that I'd just like to add about CDO, I mean, I think a good CDO, one of the roles is almost to be a UN peace keeper within the organization. So we've seen so many clients where every group is still keeping their own data and not sharing it with other groups. So you have the CFO's office isn't going to share their data with the sales, isn't going to share their data with marketing. And we all talk about tearing down silos, but unless you have a CPO or some sort of other chief analytics officer who has authority to merge that data, it's not going to happen, and everyone is going to, wants to hold on to their data, and they want people to come to them and say, gee, what are you seeing in your data, but they're not going to give it away. And then also an important thing is you're not going to just tear down silos without some sort of leadership, because otherwise who's going to be responsible for that data?
You know what's interesting to me about that? I'm sorry I had to break in because I totally agree with you in that I do a lot of these pitches. I did a keynote here in Kansas City for the Big Data Summit, and I think we're going to have a podcast for it here soon. But anyway, I start out with a culture change, breaking down silos, discovering what, understanding why, making things, your data self-service. And I feel like the attention in the room is like, yeah, we get that. Yet they don't get that. I mean, it's like the number one problem of being able to share data, have all the data, a good corpus of data by which to make decisions. And it's interesting that you start there as well, because I feel like that may be the number one problem, the number one culture change that particularly these enterprise customers have to make.
Yeah, I'm glad you used the word culture, because that's exactly the thing that the CDO needs to do, is establish the culture and communicate it and get people to buy into it. Without that, nothing's going to work.
Yeah, and the reason why the CDO or some other similar role is so important is when I've talked to companies that said, why do you merge your data or break down silos, it comes down to, I don't want to be responsible for their data. And I don't know who's going to be responsible for it. I don't know who's going to be able to look at it, who has control over who's going to look at our customer data, for example, or our employee data. So you need all of those safeties around it. And unless it's someone's job to govern this data lake or whatever you're going to call it, it's going to be another job that a team has to do who has a different job.
So back to the methodology, do you have a plan of attack when you go in? I mean, I told you my plan of attack. I don't know if it's the best one. I'm going to compare notes here and see what I can do better.
It's pretty similar. So it's, go in, understand the current state. We want people to be honest with us, because oftentimes they know what they're doing is antiquated, but we want them to fess up so that we know, all right, this is the starting point, and developing so that starting point is important. Identifying where they want to go, what's the end point, because without sort of a business goal, you're just going to do some cool stuff, show some nice dashboards, but what's the point? So really understanding that business objective, and it might be, well, that's a nice objective for 5 years from now, but give me something that we can tackle in 6 months is really important. And then it's just building a plan to get to that first checkpoint. We always believe in quick wins. So what's something that we can do, have a quick win in 6 weeks or 6 months, where we can prove to the whole organization that this is actually a worthwhile activity, rather than, all right, we're slowly working on this project to get 5 years down the road. I mean, that's just not realistic.
So if I was to give you 3 quadrants, the quadrants being this: data-driven, insight-driven, and digital transformation. Data-driven is where you're breaking down silos, you're trying to get some self-service reports. Insight-driven is prediction, automation, etc. Digital transformation is when you're really doing new business models. You may be switching from a perpetual license to an outcome-based, like annuity or a subscription model, and you're making real-time decisions, multi-cloud. Where do you find in those 3, again, data-driven, insight-driven, digital transformation, where do most clients reside today?
I think we all know it's data-driven if we're even at that point. I would think 80% or more of companies are in that data-driven or below. That being said, you have segments of large enterprises doing really remarkable things. I would venture to say nearly, every top 100 company is doing digital transformation within certain business groups or within, sometimes it's internally focused and we don't even know about it, but they're doing slices of things that are really, really impressive. But as a whole, the company is really working on the very initial steps.
Yeah, I think we should talk a little bit about business units. Progress is uneven in many places. I think Dan was talking about that. And some business units may be way far ahead in terms of optimizing data placement, doing data transfer, having certain policies, and automating everything, and others may not, particularly as the case, as I mentioned earlier, with a merger and acquisition. Again, a health hospital system, one may have been much further down the path than the next one. And that's where we come back to, trying to harmonize that across the organization. That's the biggest challenge now as people break down these data silos, is to get some kind of consistency. If you can get your data set up properly across your business unit, you can do much better cross-organizational analytics.
So give me an example of a quick win, though, because the reason I ask that question is because I tend to agree with you. And I recently had a podcast with a gentleman I work pretty closely with, Avijit Chatterjee. If you haven't heard that, for the folks listening, you should check it out. Where I shouldn't give you my answer, but we go in and we look at different use cases. We pick a use case and try to find that quick win. How do you find that quick win? I got to believe you got some tricks under your sleeve by which, because if you don't get that quick win, it feels daunting. So you got to see something in action. So I'm with you on that. How do you get that? And give me an example if you could.
Well, I think it all relates back to what's the business's problem? What are they most focused on? So, for instance, if it's their products, maybe you can figure out what are truly your top 10 products, not by just revenue, but what takes the most time to sell, what has the most parts to it, so it's difficult to ship. And, if you can put, 10 metrics around that and maybe identify, these are actually the 10 products you should be focused on. If this one costs $90 to make and you sell it for $100, but this one that, only has a $4 profit, is easier to ship, whatever metrics you come up with, and that's actually the more valuable product. And that might surprise leadership.
Yeah, but Dan, do you come in like there's so much to do here? Do you come in like with a quick win on the machine learning side with a small corpus of data promising, hey, look, you get your data straight, imagine what this is going to do? Or do you really look at, all right, we're going to talk about the need for cleansing your data in a data lake? Or do metadata come in with some unified governance, say, look at what security you can add? I mean, how do you get, these are usually big problems. So the question is how do you make that so you can get a quick win and show the potential opportunity in the future?
Can I jump in with an example?
Yes, please.
Sure. With metadata, the media entertainment example that I had mentioned earlier, when you're making a movie, you're not just making a movie, you're making 1,500 movies. It comes in parts. If you think of Avatar as a movie, there are people who are generating content in Singapore and Europe and U.S., and this became a real data problem, a real data challenge. So the thing is, it was a priority in media entertainment for those folks to get that data together as quickly as possible. In the old days, they used to just use UPSnet, meaning I have so many terabytes of content, I'm going to put it in UPS with tapes and ship it to you. One of the things that people are working on a lot now in media entertainment is this metadata approach where we'll tag the data and we'll get some better connections and better networking and ask our cloud service provider to help. There are some technologies that they've put to use in the last couple of years that have made this a much more manageable problem than it was a mere 3 or 4 years ago. So there are ways to tackle that big challenge of how do I get my various parts of my movie making to work more smoothly and get these big data pieces together more quickly. I think that's really strikes at the heart of what we're talking about. How can we get our arms around data, optimize it, ship it, use it, and solve some real business problems?
So you go in there and you say, look, we can tag or label this certain data and look at what it can do for you. So you get a subset of the data to make that one small step forward.
Oh, yeah. Well, absolutely. There's been a lot of progress made in the last number of years, I think 2 or 3 years in metadata. And when I've spoken with the media entertainment folks, they describe it as this is much better now. It's much better because of technology, and it's much better because they've learned how to do it differently. But I think, these are evolutions. It doesn't happen overnight,
Yeah. Hey, look, I've got a few minutes here. I always do a lightning round, and I want to, if you've got a couple more minutes, I'll finish up, but I want to get to know Jean. I think we already did it with you, Dan, so you may be off the hook, although you're welcome to jump in on any which one you like. But I've got a couple questions for you if you don't mind.
Yeah. Okay.
You don't seem thrilled about this.
I'm ready. No, I am very thrilled because I'm going to tell you about my previous career in journalism and how it brought me to the West Coast in the 90s, and that's how I got involved with the database world and, all that stuff. So,
well, we can go wherever you want there. But the first question I had for you, and these are just random questions, and this is kind of a transition question because it's kind of back to the business, but you talked about culture. You visit a lot of these clients. Can you describe, because I always like to compare where I'm at and what could be, the most wonderful connected company culture you've witnessed?
Company culture.
I mean, just the culture that gets it, particularly around data.
Okay, you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Sitting down here.
Yeah.
I could name many, but one that just came to mind. I hope I'm right about this. No, is American Airlines. American Airlines.
Nice.
They've evolved, and I saw them at a conference quite recently. They started off with a great data center, and the Sabre system was their creation, although it got spun off later. So they've got that down, but they've continued to evolve. At an earlier point, they went into an open systems world as early as the 90s. They put a lot of applications in open systems. They're all up to speed about cloud. They're doing a lot of cloud services. So through each major phase of the computer industry over the last 20 or 30 years, they've been there, and, the planes are running on time.
Interesting. All right, so now this is more personal. What do you do for fun? What does Jean, the advisor, do for fun?
Fun. Go to Stanford football games.
Stanford football games.
Well, it's nearby, and I get to go, and I'll miss the big game when Stanford plays Cal every year. It can get kind of ugly, because they used to take down the goalposts on either end, depending who won or lost. They alternate between being at Stanford and going to Berkeley. It's fun. There's a big game, certainly back east, I think, Harvard and Yale, Army and Navy, but this is the West Coast or Northern West Coast version.
So you're a college football all the way versus NFL?
Yes.
Yes. No, that's fine.
I find it real.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, those kids are trying hard. There's no doubt about it.
And they do go into the NFL. From Stanford, we had Andrew Luck going on to the Colts, and we had Christian McCaffrey going to the Carolina. What is it? Is it Panthers? I don't know.
Panthers.
But, yeah. So and they're darn good. They're darn good.
Nice. All right. So describe a good failure you've learned from. That's the tough one.
Is this a personal failure?
It can be anything. Yeah, business failure, anything that, it's like a growth thing for people. People like to listen to, hey, look, something that could have been a dilemma that you turned into an opportunity.
Boy, that's really hard. That's a hard one.
So you've never had a failure?
I don't think of it that way. I've had a progression. I've had a progression.
Well, what is a good progression then?
Good progression?
Yeah.
I think it's wow, that's rough. I think working with data to show you the trends that are happening and doing surveys and stuff where you can see this technology evolving and you see the proof of it in the surveys. Yeah, I think that's good. That's a hard question, Al.
That's what I'm told. These are all hard questions. I got one more. What is the craziest data problem that you've seen? Don't give me the company, just the craziest data problem that you've seen that you've had to.
I'll tell you, there's one heck of a problem. I won't tell you what year it was, just to protect myself. But years ago in Hinsdale, Illinois, once upon a time on a Sunday afternoon, they had a single point of failure, and it took down the entire Midwest. And I thought, wow, how could that happen? It was at a time when data and voice was going through a little regional office. This is how I got into high availability and disaster recovery. And that little thing, that little smoldering fire on a Sunday afternoon in an unattended data center, you know what happened? It took down all the data that was going across the entire Midwest, and the entire industry took notice and said, you know what? We're not going to let that happen again. And for example, Eli Lilly, a drug company, they were in Indianapolis, and Illinois Bell at the time, and it was a while ago, called them up and said, you've got a problem. And they said, what? And they said, your data isn't going down to your factory in Puerto Rico anymore. What? And the equivalent of AT&T brought Earth satellite dishes and trucked them overnight to Eli Lilly in Indianapolis, saying, you're going to need these tomorrow morning. Now, computing was different in those days, but that incident just totally made the point, don't have a single point of failure in your network. And with today's cloud computing and hybrid computing and things we talked about with the cloud object storage, those are all steps that we've taken to prevent that kind of thing. Not to mention having the occasional fire extinguisher around. You should have seen those frames. They were melted. They were melted.
Wow.
Yeah.
I have seen that. Being in the data business, I've seen down systems before in all different kind of ways. Hey, I think I'm switching back from business to kind of personal. What are you reading today? Where do you get all your information that then you assess, put together, aggregate, and then it results in one of your great blogs or a book?
What am I reading? I'm reading some novels, but you don't want to know about that, do you?
Well, I mean, anything goes. But
Lightning Round. I'm reading the Underground Railroad. Great book. But I have one here that's an O'Reilly publication, Streaming Change Data Capture. It's pretty good. It's a short book and talks about how data doesn't come in one flavor, it comes in many, and you have to keep up with different ways of storing that data, moving that data, protecting that data. You can't just stand still. This thing is moving.
So where do you get most of your information from? Do you get it from like blogs, podcasts, literature, all the above?
I think I'm omnivorous that way. I did start my professional life as a journalist. I think I apply a lot of the journalism techniques down to the coffee breaks at conferences to find out the things that are behind the scenes. We know the things that are being announced, but what's behind it? What are people's comfort levels? What's going on out there? I think I do bring some journalistic techniques to this.
Well, speaking of coffee breaks, I guess that's what I'll kind of end with, and that is you guys are great in terms of your interactions with the community, whoever you're around. And I felt that firsthand, like when we were in that New York visit. And everything that we talked about kind of in New York and the dialogue we were having has kind of manifested itself into this podcast as far as I'm concerned. So Dan, Jean, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today. I guarantee you will be a third timer because, we didn't even scratch the surface. But thank you for being with us today. Is there anything we left unsaid before I close?
We covered most of it, I believe.
We can do a little advertising here. If folks are looking for your services, where should they go?
Hurwitz.com. We describe everything we offer and what we do, and Hurwitz on call and all of that. And send us email and we can tell you more.
I'll do so. Thank you guys so much and appreciate you having you on. We'll put everything in the show notes. As for the third timer, we'll see you next time and we'll try to get you guys back on. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Making Data Simple podcast, where we make data fun. Be sure to visit IBMBigDataHub.com/podcasts to access the show notes and uncover even more great episodes. Remember, the views expressed here are those of the host and its guests and do not necessarily represent the views of IBM. Until next time, over and out.